Hello, lovely people. Welcome to my October reading wrap up.
Doobie 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 doo. Doobie 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 Sophie vlogs.
Realised at the end of September that I've been absolutely smashing my reading goals, and for a tiny moment I thought to myself, should I try and read 200 books this year? And then, instead of doing that, I decided to utilise this time to tackle something that I've been wanting to read for a while. Don Quixote by Cervantes. This is the Penguins Classics edition that is translated by John Rutherford. I haven't read this whole thing yet. I am, as of recording, 670 pages into this absolute beast. So I thought I would do sort of a touch base now, and then I'm hoping I might finish this in November, at least before the end of the year. Follow Don Quixote, who is he's obsessed with knights errant, and he sort of begins this delusion of himself being a knight. He has this guy called Sancho Panza who becomes his squire, and they go and they have all of these like wacky little adventures. This is from the 1600s. It is an absolute beast. It's split into two parts. I am currently chonking my way through part two. Part one is very, very episodic. Like, it is lots and lots of little tiny escapades. One thing I was really pleased by when I started reading this was how funny it is. Like, I only really knew the scene that is tilting at windmills, thinking that they are giants, and that happens in literally like chapter 4. It was wild how quickly that happened, and I was like, what's the rest of the book? There's very, very funny moments in this, particularly at the beginning when I was sort of sussing out what this was. I found myself really enjoying how silly a lot of it was. They just constantly get into these scrapes because Don Quixote, like, is always imagining these much more dramatic events than what's actually happening. There's like a moment in it when he describes himself as like a righter of wrongs, and the guy he's talking to is like, well, that's not true because before I met you, I was having a really nice time, and now I've met you, you've broken my legs. So I really enjoyed that. Part two is written much later, and part two feels a bit different. Like, I can feel that time has passed. It's not that there's not escapades. There's a lot more in part two, I feel, that is sort of like knowledgeable narration. So the conceit is like this person who is writing this account is like has gathered other people's accounts and is like compiling them into this tale of Don Quixote. I feel there's a lot more of that like self-aware narration thing kind of going on. I will confess, by 670 pages in, I am beginning to be a little bit fatigued. I think I just thought at some point that it would evolve into something a bit more, but it is still lots and lots of little interludes, and some of the interludes work a lot better for me than other interludes. I also feel I can there is like an aspect of this where I feel a great like it makes my little heart hurt a little bit sometimes that Don Quixote so wants the world to be this magical adventurous place, and it's like the reality is so not that. But so much of this book is people tricking him and playing tricks on him and all that kind of thing, or just him being like flying into a rage and doing all these things that don't need to be done. And he talks so much. I'm beginning to struggle with how much of this is just Don Quixote just like waffling on. So I definitely, every time I try and tackle like a tome, I do feel like sometimes you hit a wall and there's a bit where you're like, oh, I feel like I could put this down and I would just never pick it up again and I'd be fine. But I am pushing through and I am going to finish it.
Editing Sophie here, just interjecting to say that I cannot believe that I forgot to mention that I have been buddy reading this with Ashley over at The Untrained Librarian. I say I cannot believe because reading it with her has been really fab, and we've really kept each other going because it's such a big book. And being able to go back and forth I think has kept me reading it for a bit longer than I think I might have if I just did it on my own. So just adding that in. I will link Ashley's channel down below. She's wonderful.
To go on to the books that I actually finish in October, the first book I finished in October was The Falling in Love Montage by Ciara Smyth. I really enjoy this author. I've previously read Not My Problem by her. I think it was in my December wrap up. And I said in that one that I felt like she writes teenagers really well. I felt like I liked all the friendships. And that is definitely something that carries over into this. One thing I will say about this that I will use to transition into the plot summary for you is that I think that this is marketed as a much more light-hearted book than it actually is. And that was the only thing that I found jarring, is that I picked this up because I was doing my spooky season reading and I'd been reading quite a lot of like murders and mysteries, and I really wanted something light to take my mind off things. And what this is marketed as is like these two girls who meet and neither of them are really interested in relationships, so they agree to do the like falling in love montage, like all of the moments that would be in the montage scenes of rom-coms. They're going to do all of that, but there's not going to be this assumption that they're going to stay together forever, and they just get to do all the fun bits and not the difficult bits of a relationship. What this book is actually exploring is that the main character is deeply traumatized by the fact that her mum has early onset dementia, and she's really deeply struggling with that because she herself also has the possibility of inheriting this disease. And so it was still a good book, and I do stand by all of those things that I say about this author, is that I think that she writes teenagers really well. I think that she writes friendships so well. I care for the friendship in this book much more than I care about the actual romantic relationship in this book. I think that she just writes teenagers having, like, I love that aspect of it. Um, but it's a heavy one, actually, because this is such a big topic to grapple with. I think that it is done well. I think some of the things in this book that slightly annoyed me is that I think that the dad in this is doing a bad job of being a dad. Like, her mum has been put in a home because they can't do primary caregiving for her. There's stuff that happened in the past that is definitely like, this girl should not have been put in the situation where she was having to provide that level of care to be in these situations. Her dad, like, this isn't a spoiler, this happens like really soon on in the book, is that her dad is in a new relationship and he has proposed to his girlfriend and they're getting married, and he also wants to sell their house and move out of their house. And I just feel like in a situation where you have a teen who is going through something so difficult, who has been a primary caregiver for someone who is going through something difficult, is doing their final exams, which is such a stressful time of their life, to then just throw in, hey, not only am I getting married to this woman that you haven't really interacted with that much, but I'm also going to uproot you from your childhood home and I'm going to move you somewhere else, and I'm not going to give you that much notice about any of this happening. And that annoyed me to no end. I felt like that relationship, like I wanted so much better from it, like how that went down. I just don't feel like they really tackle those things. Whereas in contrast, his fiance, I think, is a great character, and the interactions that she had with the main character I really liked. So this is just a waffly way of saying that I do still really like Ciara Smyth's work. I think that whatever she writes, I'm gonna want to read it, and I think that it's good. I just think that the thing that she does well is that she incorporates teens going through a hard time. It's just, I would like to caveat and warn you that there is some hard times discussed in this book. A book that I read and really liked is The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. This is my third Louise Erdrich, and I'm just having such a good time exploring her work. This follows Tuki, who is, she was a convicted felon, and then when she got out of prison, she got this job at this bookshop. The bookshop is a real bookshop that the author owns, and the author as owner is slightly in the book as well. And we just sort of follow Tuki as she realizes that this customer who was kind of annoying has died and is now haunting the bookshop. That's kind of like the core story. I will say that this goes like lots of different places. I feel like the criticism that I see of this is that people really enjoy the start of the book and that story, and the way that it proceeds. It sort of drabbles around lots of different places and it loses its focus and all that kind of thing. And I do 100% see that. I feel like where you start and where you end up, like there is so much of this could have just been fleshed out, and that could have been the whole book. Like there's aspects of this as it goes on where it's like, oh, like does this even need to be in this book? Could we just tell this one story? But I have realised I love when Louise Erdrich just waffles. Like yes, this book is objectively maybe trying to do too much, and like as a result loses some focus and some drive as it goes on. But I kind of love everything that it's doing. I just love listening to Louise Erdrich write and waffle and explore themes and topics. I just find it so much fun. She writes about this bookshop and the like little recurring characters, and then this does touch on COVID because towards the end this is 2020 and lockdown happens and everything, and that sort of like community aspect of running this place that is deemed to be vital so you can keep going, and these customers and that level of community and everything I really enjoyed. Just like this look at like grief and isolation and all of that. I found the relationship that Tuki has with her partner really interesting because he is the person who arrested her, and it's like on the one hand they exist in this really comfortable way together, but there are these things that crop up as this goes on, which is like points of tension that circle around that, and like family relationships that go beyond blood, whether that's like the people that she works with who are like family to her. She has this there's this other character who is I believe like a niece but is ostensibly like a daughter to this couple. I found Tuki's like character so well defined and all that. I really enjoyed it. I do think that there are weaknesses to this. I think maybe it's not my favourite of the Louise Erdrichs that I've read, but I just want to read everything that she writes. I really like it. I don't know if I've done a good job of summarising why I like it, but I do. I also listened to Girls Don't Play Sport, the genre-changing defiant rise of women's sport and why it matters by Chloe Dalton, which was narrated by Jessica Stanley. Chloe Dalton is an Australian athlete. I think she was a rugby and now she is Aussie rules football. This is a non-fiction book that is effectively just about women and sport, whether that is like historically, like the first women who were like pioneers in sport went against the odds to make it so that women could compete in different things, or much more contemporary, like women in sport and the things that are obstacles, the things that are challenges, the things that are topics that have been going on that we've made progress with. All of these different topics. I don't have a lot to say on this one. I think it was a good book. I think it was well done. I really appreciated Chloe Dalton's perspective as someone who is in sport and has done different types of sport across her career. It's one of those where I feel like there was nothing radically new in it that I hadn't really been aware of or thought about, but it had a lot of sort of backing up that I really appreciated, whether that is from the types of interviews that she was doing and the people she was talking about, the data she was drawing on to back things up, her own personal anecdotes of having been a woman in sport for so many years. So I don't think it like blew my mind with like new revelations that I hadn't considered, but I think it is well done and I think it is having a conversation that is worthwhile. I was lent a few books this month. First of all is What Alice Forgot by Liane Moriarty. My co-worker is a big Liane Moriarty fan and she is just going to lend me a bunch of her books, so they're just going to be popping up in videos. This is about Alice who slips and falls at the gym, hits her head, forgets the last 10 years of her life. She thinks she's 29 and pregnant. She's actually 39 and has 3 children and her marriage is falling apart. And then it's like, ooh, how did she get here? We have her narrative perspective. We also have her sister who is writing these letters. There's like therapy letters because she has been having a fertility journey that has not been going so well. And then we have their adopted grandmother who is writing this like blog. The adopted grandmother's perspective could have been axed completely, not necessary to the telling of the tales, didn't care for it. I appreciated the sister's perspective because it was helpful to have someone's perspective on who Alice has become, so you can contrast like old Alice, who is currently inhabiting that body, versus these hints that you're getting from the sister of what she is like now. I find the sister's journey with her fertility to be very moving. I will say massive trigger warning about difficulties with infertility, miscarriages. That whole journey is delved into a lot in that narrative, so that's if that's something that you can't read, big hefty warning that that's very present in this. I think maybe my reading experience of this was somewhat affected by the only other Liane Moriarty that I've read is 9 Perfect Strangers. And 9 Perfect Strangers is about 9 people who go to a health resort, and halfway through things take a wild turn. So I kept expecting there to be a wild turn in this book. So Alice is, you get the sense that she is a much nastier person now than she used to be. And then there's all this mystery to do with this woman called Gina, and everyone gets really weird when Gina is mentioned. And I was coming up with some wild theories. I was like, Alice murdered Gina. Alice and Gina murdered someone together and they covered it up. Blah, blah, blah. This is not that kind of a book. This is literally a book about a woman who loses her memory, connects with her past self, and then is looking at the choices that she's made and wondering how so much can have changed in 10 years. So a lot of it is about communication, lack of communication, how we change as people, what happens when you are in a relationship and you both start to change and you're not necessarily changing together. So it's very much like quite straightforward in that sense. I enjoyed it. It's not my favourite kind of book anyway, like, it's not like the type of book that I would love, and I think as well because I kept expecting there to be a twist, it really mucked up my expectation of like pacing and stuff. So when I read the other Liane Moriartys that she's lent me, I'm going to be more aware of that as a topic. I think it is perfectly enjoyable. I think that the Alice, who is the old Alice, is irritatingly like sunshine and sparkles at time, like naive in that way where it's like, you are a 29-year-old woman, you're not a child. But it was fun. I had a good time. My dad lent me 1984 The Year Pop Went Queer by Ian Wade. This is music writing. Every chapter follows a different band or singer or musical artist, and it's all set around people who charted in 1984. And it's sort of making this argument that was like this year where like so many people in the charts were queer, or were some people in this are being focused on because of their role as allies, all of that kind of thing. This is a really fun piece of non-fiction. It is written in a way that is very readable and very light, but it does tackle heavier topics. Like every chapter also opens with a quotation that is some kind of context. A lot of it is to do with AIDS, and specifically what was happening with AIDS in 1984, to set that background for you. So then these things which might not seem so controversial or experimental or out there or anything now, you really get to understand the background in which they were happening. And I think that was really effective. Some of these chapters tie into this thesis much stronger than others. There are a few chapters where I was like, I appreciate that you wanted to write about this person and like their role in music in general. I'm not necessarily sure that all of them tapped into A, the year 1984 very well, or B, some of them were just like, okay, you've just wedged this person in. Like, it is enjoyable. If you like the 80s, if you like reading queer non-fiction, I'd really recommend giving it a go. The final book that I was lent was from my partner. This is Procopius, The Secret History. This is translated by G.A. Williamson. Procopius was writing during the Byzantine Empire, and he wrote this like official history of Emperor Justinian and all of this kind of thing. But then this is like his secret history that he was writing alongside, that is like the truth of what happened, and it is wild. There is one anecdote in this about what Empress Theodora does with some geese that will never leave me ever. This is very like salacious, and it's like, they're so corrupt, they're awful, they're doing all these terrible things, these men are ruled by their women are like loose and all of this kind of thing. Like, it was a wild ride. I would question, when you're like, maybe the truth is somewhere in between the propaganda version where they're great and this version where they are literally the worst people in the world and causing the downfall of humanity and all that kind of thing. Maybe the truth is like somewhere on the bar between those. It is a really interesting period of history. It is really interesting to see how these people are characterized, and particularly like this look at these women who actually, I think objectively, like the fact that these women had this level of power at this time, I think is so amazing. But obviously, because this is written by a man at that time, a lot of the stuff that is them having power is viewed as a very, very bad thing. So I'd be very interested to read some biographies of some of these figures to get like a look this is a contemporary look that is very biased. It would be interesting to read one that is sifting through source material and sort of giving me a lot more context for like how much of the bad stuff is really as bad as it was, and how much, like, did they do any good stuff? I don't know. So certainly an interesting piece of Byzantine history. I also read The Mill House Murders by Yukito Ayatsuji, which is translated by Ho-Ling Wong. I had a fun time reading this, and I would really recommend that if you have read this or you are interested in reading this, go to Emmy's channel and bookmark her video of her and her brother reading it and trying to solve it, because I watched that after I read it and I really enjoyed that like pairing. It's actually the second book in this series. I feel like it was translated first. I don't know if that's true, but this series is all about different houses. So the other one is the Decagon House Murders, which I have and I want to read. And it's about like all of these different houses that were built by this one architect. They are weird houses in themselves, but they also have all of these wild events that keep happening in them, and they seem to attract like death and all this kind of thing. In this one, the Mill House, we have the past plot line, which is this guy who he was in a horrible car accident, so he's in a wheelchair and he wears a little mask, and he has his wife who was like, it's a bit weird, like his wife was like the child of family friends, and so he like adopted her, like brought her into the house when she was like 15, and now he's married her and it's all a bit gross. Father was a painter. He has his father's collection of paintings, and he invites these people here every year so they can view the paintings. No one else gets to see them. And then in this past plot line, someone dies and someone goes missing and a painting goes missing, and then we pick it up a year later, and our detective guy has also arrived at the house because he was friends with the guy who's been blamed for the murder, and he doesn't think that he did it, and he's investigating it, and the story goes from there. This is one of those murder mysteries where I did call who the murderer was a fairly early on because I am suspicious. But there were aspects of it that I did not predict. Some of them were a bit wild. So I enjoyed like the process of reading it, and that's why I want to read more from this series. I think it sounds like a really interesting series, but there are these little moments where twists happen that you're like, did not see that coming. There was particularly a moment to do with this painting that no one has ever seen, which I was like, ain't no way any of us would have predicted that. So I enjoy that aspect of it. I kind of wish that I had owned the book of it, just because the book has like a map, and I think it would have been helpful to be able to keep that map open and flick back to it when you were reading like where different people were and everything, and try and figure things out together a bit. I would also say I think the characters are quite flat, but I think that is sort of an aspect of a lot of murder mysteries where the characters are not really super fleshed out, because it's not really about the characters, it's about the puzzle. And I enjoyed the puzzle, albeit it was a bit predictable. After that is Rival Queens, The Betrayal of Mary Queen of Scots by Kate Williams. Although this has Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth I on the cover, I will say that this is largely a book about Mary, in which Elizabeth is drawn on from time to time. It's a very sympathetic telling of Mary's life. You get to really see from even before she was born to when she died, how much things were against her, the difficulties she had to overcome. It's a very sympathetic look at a lot of key moments in her life, particularly when it comes to stuff like with Bothwell. I think Kate Williams makes a really impassioned plea for why we need to view this as a woman who is being exploited by men and exploited by nearly every man in her life and all that kind of thing. My favourite moments of this were actually the bits when Elizabeth was being drawn in quite a bit more, because it reminded me a bit of Helen Castor's She-Wolves, which looks at the women who ruled before Elizabeth and kind of looks at it through the angle of like, what precedent did they set that allowed Elizabeth to rule on her own? Or what challenges did they face that Elizabeth was able to learn from and not repeat? And there was an aspect of that to this, which was like, Elizabeth, everything that Mary does wrong reflects back on Elizabeth, because they're both queens trying to rule independently. And it's like Mary's failings are somehow seen as Elizabeth's faults. And that, as an aspect of their relationship, I think is a really interesting thing to look at. And this made me think about how many moments in this period of history were those moments that change everything. Like, this is just a random example, but when the Pope sort of declares that Elizabeth is open season, and if anyone kills Elizabeth, like, they're doing a favour to the Catholic Church. That, like, challenge to her authority and her safety comes at a time when Mary could have really used her explicit support. And it's like all of these moments where Elizabeth could have been more explicitly supportive of Mary. Why didn't she? Usually because things that Mary were doing were setting a precedent to cause questioning of Elizabeth's own legitimacy. And something else that it does well is it talks about the way that Mary loses control of situations or misinterprets the best way to react to situations. There's a lot of moments where you get these turning point moments where Kate Williams talks about, like, oh, you know, this is how Mary behaved. If she'd behaved in this way, it's very likely she would have been more successful, but that's not what she did. I read quite a lot of stuff across my life that falls in this time period. I think that this was an interesting perspective and I enjoyed reading it. Next up is The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. I don't know who translated this version because I got it from Project Gutenberg. This was wildly melodramatic and I kind of really enjoyed it. This is the story that the very famous musical is based on. It is quite different to the musical. There's a whole character in this called the Persian who is not present in the musical at all. I really liked him. He was one of the real people in this book who had agency. Small plot summary: we are set at this opera in Paris and there is this rumoured opera ghost who makes demands of the people who own the opera, and when things don't go his way, like, people appear dead and all this kind of stuff. And then there's this sort of micro story that is Christine Daae, who is a singer at the opera, and Raoul, who is like a count of something or something. They're like falling in love, but this opera ghost is obsessed with Christine and all of this kind of thing. It's very, very melodramatic. It's very heightened emotions. Some of my favourite bits of this were, I do think that the visual descriptions in this are fab. Like, this underground opera world that is described is so cool. When the Persian and Raoul go to try and find Christine after Eric, the opera ghost, has abducted her, this journey they go on in the bowels of the opera is so cool and so evocative. I really, really enjoyed that. What I struggled with was that there's quite a large cast of characters in this, actually, and you'll be doing something like the Persian and Raoul going through the bowels of the opera, ooh, very, very tense, and then you'll just cut away and you'll have a whole drabble about, like, the two guys who own the opera and blah, 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 and it's just like, those people are not fleshed out enough for you to really care. So it means that you get moments when you're really building, like, pace and tension and all of that, and then you're just taken away for, like, a little drabble with some people that you don't really know and you don't really care about very much. So those bits sort of, like, slowed the narrative down for me, and I felt that, like, pace change when they happened. I will also say that I understand why some changes were made for the musical. For example, Raoul is such a drip in this. Christine is such a drip in this. Eric is so, like, you could have had it all but you blew it. I enjoyed it. It's unlike, and it's hard to categorize. I feel it's quite unlike anything. Like, it is gothic, but it's also, like, melodramatic in a different way and all that kind of thing. So I'm glad that I finally read it. I had a fun time. I do sometimes think that some of the pacing drags you down, but it was fun. After that is Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard. This is a tiny novella that is set in sort of a pre-colonial Vietnamese-inspired world, and it is a little romance. We have Princess Tan, who was sent away as a hostage as a child, and now she is back in the country where she is the princess, and they're trying to do this, like, trade deal with the people who she was in exile with. But alongside that, this like fire spirit thing who appears, and shenanigans ensue. I feel like I could read, like, a whole novel set in this world. This world seems very intriguing. It's very much background world building. Like, you don't get a lot of info dumping or anything. It's just you sort of pick up from what's happening, what the background is, and that's why I wish I'd love to have had more of that. Liane and Erdrich are the two characters that I think are sort of very distinctly fleshed out in this. I felt like the third character was much less developed than those two, and I kind of wished that she had more depth to her. The nature of this being so small is that you're always going to have those little bits that you're like, oh, I wish that this had more depth, I wish that this was explored further. I think that there's some plot stuff that happens where I'm like, don't really understand why this was necessary. But one thing that I really like about Aliette de Bodard is I think that she writes really well. I really like the actual prose that she writes, and I think that she creates really interesting worlds. So that's why I kind of wish that this was almost a longer book with more narrative to it. Next up is Notes from an Island by Tove Jansson, which is narrated by Sandi Toksvig. This is for my Read the World project for Finland. I kind of wish I had started with a different Tove Jansson. I will say this is the only one that my library had, so that's why I tried it. It's a very, very short narrative about Tove and her partner Tuki. They own this like little hut that's very remote, and it's just kind of like their time there, how they spend their time, like fishing and doing the hut up and all this kind of thing, and then this transition from them like much younger and the time they spent there and how they did it to this point at which they realize that they're getting a bit too old and they can't do it anymore and they need to like let this place go. The only reason I say that I wish I hadn't started here is, first of all, there are images that come with the actual book version of this that are done by Tuki, and I didn't have access to those because it was an audio version. And then second of all, because this sort of, I don't know that much about Tove Jansson, and I kind of feel like I should have read some of her other works before reading this, but I didn't know what this was, so I didn't know that that was the thing that I should do. It was sweet, I enjoyed it, it has made me want to read more of her work. If you have recommendations for her work, I would really appreciate that. Very nearly at the end now, I will briefly mention Japanese Colour Prints by the Great Artist Collection. This is an interesting selection of Japanese colour prints. It has an introduction that talks a little bit about context for this time, both historically and in the art movement. I'm not knowledgeable enough to know how well that is put together, but I do think that this author's absolute disdain for non-plant-based ink feels a little harsh. He is damning of it and like says that it ruins this whole art movement and everything, which is interesting. But the actual prints in this I really enjoyed. I really like Japanese prints, but I still figuring out what artists I like. The Art of Jim Burns' Hyperluminal. This is a science fiction fantasy artist. He did a lot of covers of books like George R.R. Martin, that kind of thing, so you might be familiar with some of his work and not know it. He is one of my dad's favourite artists, and I enjoyed understanding a bit more about his influences and the types of work that he has done and all that kind of thing. I don't think it's my favourite art style personally. It is very much this sort of like computer done 3D kind of things, and I like it but I don't love it, but I did enjoy getting an insight into his work. And then the final book I listened to is Disability Visibility, which is edited by Alice Wong and narrated by Alejandra Ospina. I don't have that much to say about this. It's a collection that a lot of you probably already know. I really appreciated the depth and breadth of perspectives given in this. I think that it was really successful at covering lots and lots of different topics and different viewpoints and backgrounds and perspectives. I don't think it comes across as a book that is just written to educate able-bodied people. I feel like if you are a disabled person who is listening to this or reading it, there'll be a lot that you can connect with. It does handle a lot of very heavy topics, so I would say research trigger warnings. Every chapter has trigger warnings at the start of it, which was really helpful for knowing when to listen to certain things. I kind of wish that it had had a cast of narrators just to reflect the identities of the people who had written the pieces. I think maybe multiple voices I would have really enjoyed, and in that way I kind of wish that I had read the physical version, because I know the physical version has a lot more resources and stuff that the audio version doesn't. But all of that said, I do think it's a very well put together collection. I certainly learned a lot. I certainly valued the listening experience of it. That is everything I wanted to talk about this time. Thank you so much for listening for so long. I would love to hear what you read in October. Did you pick up anything fab? Do leave me a comment down below if you fancy it. Otherwise, in the meantime, I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you next time for something different.